folks, so we are back. In the previous videos we had looked at the basic idea of what is a radio button and what is a radio group and how do they work together. Then we had also set up our layout, and I've actually run a version of that layout so you can see looks pretty similar here. One thing to point out, when we set up our layout, we already get, just by the fact that we've put the radio buttons in a radio group, we already get the logical behavior. So you can see as I click from one to another, only one of those buttons is going to be selected at any given time. And that's going to be true just because of the way we set the layout up here in the XML file. I can come over here and you can see the only thing I've done in my Java code is just put in some comments for what we're going to do, but we haven't written any code for those event handlers yet. But the nice thing is my radio buttons already know what to do because they're in the same radio group. Alright, so what I would like to do now in this video is continue on from this point. So we've got our component set up, and now we're going to go ahead and code the Java that's going to give us some behavior. And so what we want to have happen is when the user comes along and selects a sauce, and again I can kind of illustrate this here, when we come along and select a sauce and hit that select button, I want to display a message down here that says what kind of sauce they had selected. So I want to display, in this case I display you picked medium or you picked hot or what have you. So that's one button. Then for the other button, I want to set up a reset button where when the user selects this, we're not going to go back to this neutral state or the starting state. So we'll uncheck all of the buttons and we'll reset the text that shows up down here. So that's the basic idea. That's where we're going. Now let's see what we need to do to make that happen. So first off, I'm going to go into my code and I need to create some variables to get to my components. So I think y'all know how this works. I actually am going to need a variable for each of my 4 radio buttons. I'm going to need a variable for my radio group. I'm going to need one for each of the buttons that I want to be able to click on and respond to, and then I also need one for my output area. So a lot of variables to set up. I'm going to go through, I'll talk through the first one, which I'll set up one of my radio buttons to start with, and the rest of them I'm going to do kind of quickly. So for my radio button, I need again one for each of my options. Use my same basic cast and my find view by ID, and then go look for the ID for the button that I'm selecting. Alright, so final radio button, RB mild, cast to radio button here, find the view that goes along with the ID, RB mild. I think you're pretty familiar with that, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. The one thing I will say is because I'm going to be using an anonymous inner class for event handling, I am setting, and I'm going to refer to these radio buttons from inside that anonymous inner class. Java requires me to make those variables final, and what that does is that prevents me from later on the fly changing what component that variable is referring to. And so it's just a little kind of a safety precaution. So I'm just going to kind of go ahead and build out the next few. And yes, I really am typing this out live. So you may see me correcting a few typos, like 3 T's and button, but we're going to follow the same basic pattern. So So there's my 4 radio buttons. I also need my radio group, and I can follow the same pattern for that. For its variable name, I'm going to call it sauce group, which also is the ID that I used. And again, I can use find view by ID to go in and find that ID that I set up. Alright, so got the sauce group. Then I need my output text, which is a text view. And we can find it. And then I need, finally, my two buttons. Now the buttons I don't need to make final because I'm not going to be referring to them from inside the event handlers. So they can just be declared here. I need my select button. And I need my reset button. Depending on what import statements you have, you may need to add import statements for one or more of these classes. I think I've got several import statements already set up in this class because I've sort of played around with it a little bit. But if you need to add an import statement, up here I've got button, I've got radio button, I've got radio group, and I've got text view. So you may need to add some of those as you go. Alright, but those are all of my variables that I have set up. Alright, so got those. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and set up an event handler for the select button. And so before I just start writing the code, let's go ahead and think about what needs to happen. We described it generally here, but let's drill a little bit further into that logic. And so the way I'm going to set this one up, and there are alternative ways of setting this up that could get you to the correct result, but the way I'm going to set it up is, first of all, I'm going to set up a string to hold the output that I want to display. Then I'm going to use an if-else-if selection structure to sequentially check each of my 4 buttons, and then based on which one is selected, assign a value to that output string. So if the mild button is selected, I'm going to set the output string to mild. If the medium button is selected, I'm going to set the output button to medium. Now, if you're unfamiliar with, or if you need a refresher on this if-else-if selection structure, I've got a separate set of videos that you can go and refer to. If you're comfortable with this and you know how to use if-else-if and you don't need a refresher, no need to go watch those videos unless you just really like looking at that stuff. But they're there as a resource in case you do need them. Now, so the logic that I've got is if the mild button is selected, we set the output button to mild. Medium, do the same thing for hot, do the same thing for nuclear, and then I've also set up kind of a fallback position. And what I'm thinking of here is, well, what happens if the user were to launch the app, and here's the basic app, and let's say they didn't have anything selected and they hit that select button with none of the buttons selected. Well, in that case, the first 4 of these possibilities would not be executed because they all depend on having a particular button selected. And so I wanted kind of a fallback case. And in this case, if we hit select with none of the buttons actually being chosen, then I'm going to go to the fallback output value of unknown. So basically my 3 steps are declare an output string. This big if-else-if structure decides what value we put in that output string. And then finally, I'm going to display the output string. Alright, so let's go back into Android Studio and make this happen. So, first thing I want to do, I'm going to use an anonymous inner class, and of course, as you know, you could certainly do this with a dedicated method and an onClick attribute for your button, but all that would change is the structure. That wouldn't change the logic inside the event handler. So, for btn select, we're going to go ahead and set the onClick listener, and then inside the parentheses here, I'll start typing in new view, and once I see that view.onClickListener available, I can just select it, and that sets up my structure for me. So this is my event handler, and this is where I need to put in my 3 steps, where I need to go ahead and create an output variable, then have my if-else if structure to assign a value to the variable, and then finally display the variable in my output area. Alright, so set the variable up, figure out what value to put into it, and then display it. Alright, so my output variable in this case is going to be a string. I'm going to call it selection, and then I'm going to start by initializing it to an empty string. And the reason I'm doing that is, first of all, this is a local variable, right? So it's declared inside a method, which makes it local. And then I'm going to be using this selection structure to assign a value to it. And if I were to set up the selection structure in such a way so that we could go all the way through it and not actually assign a value, then I would get a syntax error here, and it would be an uninitialized local variable. So to avoid that, I'm in the habit of just going ahead and initializing my local variables to something. Alright, so that's kind of what I'm doing. Now let's go ahead and get started. Now, what I want to check in my first if statement is if the first of my radio buttons has been selected. So let me go back to my PowerPoint and just refresh your memory on the methods that we've got. Here's the method that I'm going to use. It's the isChecked method. I run that for each button, and it tells me true if the button is selected and false if it's not selected. So that's what we're going to do here. And so I'm going to start and just kind of go through the buttons one at a time. And so, actually I'm going to start with mild, and isChecked is the method I'm running. Alright, so then I can set up my first structure here. So if the mild button is checked, then we'll set selection to the word mild. Alright. Then, continuing with my else if, and remember this is a great structure for checking a sequence of related choices or related decisions. We're going to go through and do the same thing for the medium button. If the medium button is checked, we'll select our selection to the word medium. And then, getting my brackets out of place there. Then we'll do the same thing for hot. We'll do the same thing for nuclear. So, got my first 4 clauses set up. So if the mild button is checked, we set it to mild, set selection to mild, and then we go through and we sequentially select each of the others. The last piece I need is what I want to have happen if none of those buttons are checked. And so I'm going to close with an else that's not followed by an if. So this clause is only going to be executed if we go through all 4 of the checks that we have written previously and none of them come out to be true. And so remember, that was the situation where we decided we want to go ahead and just say unknown here. Alright, so going through, this is the if-else if structure that is going to figure out what is the actual value of that selection that we're going to display. And using an if-else if structure like this to check a set of radio buttons is a pretty common way to handle them. If you're familiar with Java syntax and other types of selection structures, you could also use a switch here, and you could certainly get to the same basic outcome. If you're not familiar with switches, don't worry about it because this will get us to the outcome that we want. And I think the logic is straightforward enough so that you can follow it. And of course, if you can always check with me with questions if you have any. All right, so then finally, we need a statement for this last activity or this last task here, and that's to go ahead and write that display out to our text output area. And so you've seen how to do this, and I think it's fairly familiar. I'm going to use the set text method, and what I'm going to do is put in a few words. I'm going to concatenate my selection with those words, and then just to show I'm excited, we'll go ahead and finish it off with an exclamation point. So that's my text output, setting that back out. So we're just recognizing or reflecting the fact that we're able to figure out which of our radio button which of our radio buttons, is selected, and then respond to that. So let's go ahead and test this out. Send it out to my emulator. Let that build run and let that revised activity launch. I'm actually going to check out my fallback case first. So when I start out, none of the buttons is selected. If I hit select now, I see my unknown case popping up. But then let's try some of the others. So let's try nuclear, medium, hot, and mild. And it looks like all of my options are working well. Now, obviously, like I say, simple example here. We could certainly do a lot more in response to those radio buttons, but this is basically a proof of concept. All right, now, that's my select button. The last thing I want to do is the logic for my reset button, and this is going to be much shorter. Don't have to do a big if, else if, because there's really only two things that I want to make happen when that reset button is selected. I want to deselect all the buttons in the group, and then I want to go back and display my default output string. So for that, again, let me scroll up and just remind you of some of the methods that we looked at. The method I'm going to use for resetting the buttons is the clear check method, and I'll have to call this using a radio group variable because this is a method that's defined in the radio group class. And then I'll just use set text to set my text output back to what I want it to be. Alright, so let's go back in, and this is going to have to be a separate event handler because it's a separate button. And so this is going to be an event handler for my reset button. So btn reset, set on click listener, new view, hit enter to get my structure, and again a few comments. I want to uncheck all the radio buttons, and I want to set my output text back to the default. Alright, so good news is I can do each of those in a single line of code. Said uncheck all the radio buttons. I am going to use the radio group variable that I'd created up here in my variable declarations sauce group, and I am going to use that to call clear check. And that's all I have to do. This method doesn't require any arguments. It also doesn't give me anything back, so I don't need to do anything with the return value. But that's all I need right there. And when that method executes, when the user clicks that reset button, it's going to clear out all those radio button selections. And then finally, I am going to set text output back to the default starting text. And I'm actually going to do this two different ways and show you two different ways of doing it. And so the easy, direct way is just to go ahead and type in that string, which I think if I remember correctly it said output goes here. And so let's try that, we'll demo it, and then I'll show you a slightly more sophisticated way of doing this. Alright, so 2 lines of code for my reset button event handler. Alright, and again we'll run this back out to our emulator. Okie doke. And let's go ahead and make a selection. So we haven't broken the selection button, it still works the way it's supposed to work. But let's see what happens when we click reset. and it looks like that's doing what we wanted as well. So it's unchecking everything when that clear check method runs, and then I'm saying output goes here and sending that back out to my text area. Alright, and we can kind of keep playing with this, and we can, choose different options, play around with different combinations, and verify that everything is doing what we're supposed to do. So, like I say, I could certainly stop here because I've got the functionality that I want, but one more little tidbit that I want to add for you, and that is, notice when I mouse over this hard-coded string literal here, I'm getting a little message that says, you could do this better. And what it's telling me here is that because I've hard-coded that string in, we can't translate it. And so a better way of doing that, instead of using this hard-coded string, would be to go back to my resources that I set up, and remember the resource that we're referring to here is my strings XML file. That's the resource that we're talking about. And retrieve that value from those resources. So let me show you how to do this. It's really similar to the way we retrieve an ID up here. So when we retrieve an ID, we go to R for the resources folder, and we retrieve an ID, and in this case we're putting in the ID that we want. We can do the same thing with our text strings. And so what I would do is, instead of typing in that literal, I'd put in R. In this case, I want to put in not ID, but string, and then the key for the string, which is txt output. And so what that will do is retrieve that default output string for me. Alright, simple change. So instead of hard-coded string, I'm pulling a string from my XML file. Again, let's go back one more time and run this and test it. And so hit mild, I see that message, hit reset, and there's my output goes here. So we're retrieving that string from the XML file. And the benefit, of course, of that is, there's two benefits really. One is that we don't have to replicate it, and if we were to change what that string is, we only have one place we have to change it now, and that's in the strings XML file. And then also the other benefit is, if we do go in and put translations in later on, this string can be translated. We could set up, similarly, we could set up a string for the rest of the text that we're using here. And that would actually be fairly easy to do. In fact, we can do that kind of automatically here by setting up that string literal, and we can actually go ahead and create a string right here. I'm not going to do that right this second, but we could certainly do that, and that way we would have and we could do this for our other strings as well that we're working with. We could have a very, very flexible app by going through and using that basic resource. Alright, so I'm going to stop this here. I hope this has been a good introduction for some of the capabilities of radio buttons and radio groups. But if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to give me a shout. Thanks a lot.